our paralegal accidentally included additional pages in the electronic copy, but the copy that's there is the same copy you have.
I don't know which copy's there. What did you mark as?
It's right there at 27.
The one that was sent to us has highlights on it.
Yeah, I don't know.
What they marked as in the exhibit is the copy that was given, so I'm not sure what was sent, but we'll sort it out.
All right, hold on a second, Jennifer. Okay, so,
Our paralegal accidentally sent over a different version than what I've had marked, but what I've had marked is the same copy that the state has.
all right, so are we good now?
I'm assuming that
I
was
think
in
we're
the
fine,
record.
thank you.
No, none of this needs to be on the record. This is just a snafu about an exhibit. It's not a big deal.
Went to the 20, this is a 15-page one. Ms. Whitney will need to be informed of what's in their email.
Let's just withdraw that warrant so that it doesn't have highlights on it. It's already marked.
So presumably if it's already marked, Mrs. Winnie's got the right one.
Correct. The one that was emailed over, something's wrong.
All right, so can you tell them you can go ahead and bring the jury in after all? Thanks, Anna. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Please be seated. And continue when you're ready, Ms. Eakes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Did you learn that at some point fire applied a BVM, a bag valve mask, to supply Mr. Ellis with oxygen at the scene?
Yes.
And does the fact that Mr. Ellis, his lack of recovery after fire did that affect your opinion in any way?
No.
Why not?
Well, going back to the analogy that we gave about the campfire that's, been suppressed, somebody's thrown dirt on it and so forth. I mean, we've all had situations like that where you put out a fire. Now, depending on how long that you're into that process, sometimes you can bring the fire back, by bringing some air, oxygen into it. But sometimes it's too far gone. That fire is out, and so in this situation, carrying through the analogy, Mr. Ellis had a cardiac arrest because of hypoxia related to restraint asphyxia, in my opinion. So it's not as simple as, okay, well, let's just give him oxygen now and he'll come back to normal. if he's so far along on this process that his heart has stopped and his electrical system has gone, haywire, you're not necessarily going to be able to restore rhythm and restore circulation. In a sense, physiologically, he's fallen off the edge of the cliff. You can't just bring him back that easily. So it's not surprising to me that he didn't recover, despite the fact that the fire department paramedics were providing him with oxygen.
So even if Mr. Ellis did have some pulse, weak, thready pulse over that time that he's getting oxygen, would it still not be able to recover by giving them the oxygen?
Correct.
Oh. All right, I want to switch gears and ask you about, you said earlier that you reviewed some of the defense expert reports, is that right?
Yes.
They're medical experts?
Yes.
And what do the defense medical experts claim caused Mr. Ellis's death?
Highly firm motion.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind there, but,
I'll ask a different question.
okay. I assume you're getting back to it, though. We still may need to talk about this. Well, that of itself doesn't bother me. Go ahead.
Doctor, do you have an opinion as to whether or not Mr. Ellis's cardiac arrest was caused by by the fact that he had methamphetamine on
Ye-
board?
Yes, I have an opinion.
And what is your opinion on that?
My opinion is that his cardiac arrest was not due to methamphetamine.
And can you explain why you hold that opinion?
Yes. Methamphetamine, if it is the primary or sole cause of a cardiac arrest, is going to cause the cardiac arrest by causing ventricular arrhythmias. Arrhythmias originating in the ventricles, the major pumping chambers, and it's going to be a rapid or highly chaotic rhythm disorder that is not compatible with maintaining circulation. So that's either ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. We know in the case of Mr. Ellis that the first rhythm that was obtained was sinus rhythm, sinus rhythm, sinus bradycardia, PEA, and asystole. None of those rhythms that were detected before he was given epinephrine were ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. None of the EKG rhythms that he had prior to epinephrine were rhythm disorders consistent with methamphetamine.
Do you have any illustratives that would help explain or show what a ventricular tachycardia looks like?
Yes.
We could take a look at 560, please. You recognize that?
Yes. May I approach
It's not on yet.
Oh, okay.
Is this an illustrative that would help you explain ventricular tachycardia?
Yes.
I'd offer 560 for illustrative purposes.
560 is admitted for illustrative purposes only.
Okay, you can just kind of walk us through what you have here and explain what you're looking at.
Okay, so again, just to refresh our memory, this is a normal ECG, EKG are the same thing. So this is the normal rhythm, the P wave, the QRS, and then the T wave, and this is kind of a normal rate, about a rate of 70, which is kind of a typical average heart rate. This is ventricular tachycardia. Monomorphic means that each of these complexes has the same morphology or shape, but the key thing is ventricular tachycardia. Ventricular meaning that these rhythms originate in the ventricles, the lower pumping chambers. Remember, it's supposed to start up here, the sinoatrial node, and go from north to south. Here, it's going from south to north. So it's upending the whole sequence of things, and look how fast it's going. Again, this is the typical heart rate, 70. Here, you're going at a heart rate of 270. So this will cause cardiac arrest for two reasons. One is it's going so fast that the heart can't handle that kind of rapid heartbeat. And secondly, is going the wrong direction. It's going from south to north rather than north to south. So this is ventricular tachycardia. Methamphetamine, which is a stimulant, which makes the heart beat faster and can cause the heart to go haywire, can cause ventricular tachycardia. Ventricular tachycardia was not the rhythm that Mr. Ellis had at the time of his cardiac arrest. Remember, we looked at that atrial fibrillation was actually a bit on the slow side, which is typical for hypoxia, low oxygen. So this is ventricular tachycardia. He had ventricular arrhythmias like this after he was given epinephrine. Because guess what? Epinephrine is very much like methamphetamine. It's a stimulant. We use it to try to bring a heart that's dead back to life, but it's dangerous in the sense that it can overstimulate the heart. So what he had after epinephrine doesn't tell us about what happened initially. Initially what he had was not ventricular tachycardia, and therefore I'm concluding that his methamphetamine was not the culprit in causing the cardiac arrest.
Okay. And
So just to add one more thing, there's dying with methamphetamine and dying because of methamphetamine. In this case, it's my opinion, Mr. Ellis died with methamphetamine, but not because of amphetamine.
you said the second type of arrhythmia that can be caused by methamphetamine was ventricular fibrillation, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and do you also have an illustrative that would help explain to the jury what ventricular fibrillation is?
Yes.
And if we could have them look at 559, please. And do you recognize that?
Yes.
And is that an illustrative that would help you explain ventricular fibrillation?
Yes.
I'd offer 559, please, for illustrative.
559 is admitted for illustrative purposes only.
All right, so can you just explain the difference between ventricular tachycardia and then ventricular fibrillation, please?
Yes, so the ventricular tachycardia is more organized. You saw it, it had kind of consistent shape. It was very fast, and it was going in the wrong direction, from the ventricles up rather than from the atria down to the ventricles. But it was organized in a sense. Ventricular fibrillation is complete electrical storm, electrical chaos. Remember we talked about atrial fibrillation before the lunch break, because Mr. Ellis did have atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation is the upper chambers having irregular rhythm. That is compatible with life and normal circulation. When this is occurring in the ventricles, in the major pumping chambers, and this happens, then this is instant death. This kills quicker than a gunshot to the head, because the heart stops immediately, because it's going very rapidly and it's total chaos. There's nothing organized, there's nothing that will cause a true effective muscle contraction. So this is the kind of, we've all heard, and hopefully you haven't seen it, but you've heard about someone who's, gee, he was at the golf course and he just keeled over and died. That's usually because of this, ventricular fibrillation. It can occur in somebody that's had a heart attack. It can occur in somebody that has a very bad heart. It can occur in people that have methamphetamine intoxication as well. But this is not what Mr. Ellis had.
Can somebody recover from ventricular fibrillation without medical intervention?
No. There's only one way you can recover from this. That's electric shock.
So is it possible, or do you have an opinion as to whether or not Mr. Ellis could have been experiencing ventricular fibrillation before the leads were ever put on him, and then we just don't see that because we didn't have the leads on?
Object foundation.
Overruled. If you can answer, Doctor.
Not possible.
And why not?
Because you don't go from this totally degenerated electrical rhythm into what was more organized rhythm originating in the atrial chambers. You can't, it's like throwing a jigsaw puzzle into 1,000 pieces and thinking that in a snap of your finger you can get that puzzle all back together. Not going to happen. I mean, maybe Harry Potter could do it, but it's not going to happen in real life. So it doesn't go. Other than electric shock, which is kind of like rebooting the system, and you're hoping the heart rhythm will go back to normal, nothing else will take care of that.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago atrial fibrillation. Do you have an illustrative that would help explain atrial fibrillation?
Yes.
Can you take a look at 555, please? And is this an illustrative that would help you explain atrial fibrillation?
Yes.
And offer 555 for illustrative purposes?
No objection.
855 is admitted for illustrative purposes only. 855.
555.
555, I'm sorry.
Did I say 855? I'm sorry. Oh, I did? I meant 555.
Okay, 555.
Sorry, it's the afternoon.
I'm just glad it was you, not me for once. Go ahead, Ms.
It's
Eakes.
always me, it's okay. All right, okay, it's up on the screen there, Doctor. If you can just explain to us what we're seeing here in terms of the atrial fibrillation.
Well, you've seen this before. You've seen this when we looked at the EKG rhythm strips that were obtained on Mr. Ellis when Tacoma fire paramedics started taking care of him. So this is really very similar. The fibrillation is in the atria. The ventricles are getting these spikes. So the ventricles are getting a normal kind of stimulus. The heart rate is somewhat irregular. As you can see, the intervals between one spike and another vary. But the heart rate is not too rapid, and it's not, occurring in a fashion that reverses the normal direction, because it's coming from the atrial chambers down to the ventricles. So it's going north to south the way you need it to. It's not going too fast. And it's certainly not looking like ventricular fibrillation, which was just total chaotic, squiggling of no spikes, and therefore with ventricular fibrillation there's no stimulus that will get the heart muscle to contract. Here you have the spikes, the QRS, which makes the heart muscle, the ventricles, contract in a fashion that is physiologic and can maintain normal blood pressure, normal pulse, and normal life function.
And do the little bumps between the QRS spikes, do those translate in any way to heart rate?
No. So this is in the atria, but good Lord developed all kinds of checks and balances in our body. So there is a relay station between the atrial chambers and the ventricular chambers. It's called the AV node, N-O-D-E, and that serves as a filter. So if there are too many stimuli coming from the atrial chambers, this AV node can say, nah, not letting you all in, just 1 out of 4 is going to go, so that we get the ventricular spikes occurring at a physiologic range. Before we saw a normal rhythm, rate of 70. This is the atrial fibrillation. It's not entirely normal, but the heart rate is around 80, which is totally within physiologic range. So what's happening up the atrial chambers is not reflected in the heart rate. The heart rate is defined by these spikes, and that heart rate is acceptable and physiologic.
Okay, so would it be accurate to say that those little bumps in between mean that a heart's trying to go super fast, but it's not able to do that?
No, it's not a question of able. I mean, there is increased atrial rate, but the AV node, that relay station, protects the major pumping chambers from getting overstimulated. And that's why atrial fibrillation is compatible with living. I mean, I have patients that have been in atrial fibrillation for decades, and they're walking around doing their job and not even noticing any symptoms. So this is not a lethal rhythm. Ventricular fibrillation is a lethal rhythm disorder.
And so maybe you've just answered this, but how do atrial and ventricular fibrillation differ then?
Gee, I hope I've answered that. Okay. Atrial fibrillation, not lethal. Ventricular fibrillation, lethal. Atrial fibrillation is not going, too rapidly, and it's not causing any damage to the heart. Ventricular fibrillation causes cardiac arrest.
You can take your seat again if you want. I want to go back and talk about the life impact data for a minute. If Mr. Ellis's cardiac arrest in this case was due to a meth overdose or his underlying heart condition, would you expect to have seen that have normal sinus rhythm on the initial rhythm strips that you saw?
I'm going to object, leading mischaracterized testimony.
Well, I'm sure you can correct that if it's wrong. And it is mildly leading, but I'm going to permit this. You may answer, Doctor.
So if the cardiac arrest was due to methamphetamine or due to underlying cardiac disease, the initial EKG at the time of the cardiac arrest would have been ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. It would not have been atrial fibrillation, as we saw, or as was reported on the pre-hospital care report, sinus rhythm, sinus bradycardia.
And could a fatal cardiac event brought on by meth overdose have occurred prior to the rhythms that were captured here by the life pack?
No,
Why not?
because as we mentioned before, ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation are more advanced, more serious, more degenerated cardiac rhythm disorders. They don't spontaneously self-heal and get back to a physiologic type of rhythm. That doesn't happen. You have to have medical intervention, electric shock for ventricular fibrillation, and for ventricular tachycardia when it's, very rapid.
Does a meth overdose cause PEA?
No,
And would meth-induced cardiac arrest cause a slowing of the pulse and shallow breathing?
no.
And why not?
It's a stimulant. It increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, doesn't cause bradycardia or PEA.
I want to ask you about Mr. Ellis's the autopsy. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Mr. Ellis had a dilated cardiomyopathy and left ventricular hypertrophy. Are you familiar with those two conditions?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell the jury what it means to have a cardiomyopathy, and do you have a illustrative that would help explain that?
Yes and yes.
Thank you. If we could have a look at 556, please. Is that an illustrative that would assist you in explaining the dilated cardiomyopathy?
Yes.
All right, I'd offer 556 for demonstrative purposes.
Okay,
May I approach?
556 is admitted for illustrative purposes only.
Thank you. You can step down.
Okay, over here, normal heart. Remember we talked about the 4 chambers of the heart. Right atrium, right ventricle. Left atrium, left ventricle. The arrow here, by the way, is not electrical activity, which I told you is going north to south. This is blood flow. The flow of blood coming out of the heart into the aorta. Dilated cardiomyopathy. Dilated means enlarged. Cardio means heart. Myo, M-Y-O, means muscle. Path, P-A-T-H, like pathologic, means disease. So cardiomyopathy means disease of the heart muscle. So in dilated cardiomyopathy, the ventricles, particularly the left ventricle, is enlarged. You compare this left ventricle to this left ventricle, and you see that this left ventricle is larger, significantly larger. Now, this, I just want to make clear, this is used for, we're using this for illustrative purposes. This does not reflect the reality of Mr. Ellis's heart condition. This is more dramatic because it's showing a more severe case, but it's used to make the point. Mr. Ellis had dilated cardiomyopathy, but of a much milder pattern.
Can we talk about that? Do you remember, recall from the autopsy what the size of Mr. Ellis's heart was?
Yes,
Weight.
they weigh the heart, and the normal heart in a male is 400 grams. Some people will say up to 500 grams. His was 480 grams. So if we accept the stricter definition of 400 grams, it is enlarged. But in a case of severe dilated cardiomyopathy, and I've seen many cases of dilated cardiomyopathy, and we're able to assess the heart mass and the heart size even while people are alive using CAT scans, MRIs, or ultrasound examinations. So a severe case, the heart mass, the weight would be 700 grams, 800 grams. So he was 480 grams. So he had cardiomyopathy, but it was on the mild end of the spectrum insofar as that quantification is concerned.
Do you have an opinion then as to whether or not Mr. Ellis's enlarged heart was the sole cause of his death?
Yeah, I do have an opinion, yes.
And what's your opinion?
My opinion is that it was not the sole cause of his death.
Now, the other condition that was mentioned was left ventricular hypertrophy. And do you have an illustrative that would, and I probably said that wrong, but do you have an illustrative that would assist in discussing that?
Yes.
Okay, if you could take a look at Exhibit 557, please. And is that the illustrative that would assist
Yes.
you in explaining?
Yes.
I'll offer 557 for illustrative purposes.
7 is admitted for illustrative purposes only.
Can you just explain to the jury what we're looking at here?
Okay, so again, the normal heart that you've now become very familiar with, you know, the 4 chambers, a little bit a different depiction of it, right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. And we're going to focus now on the muscle in the wall of the left ventricle. This is the muscle right here. And this is with left ventricle hypertrophy. Hypertrophy. So hypertrophy means increased thickness of the heart muscle. So you can see it visually. Look at muscle in the wall here and compare it to the muscle thickness over here. This is thicker. So that's left ventricle hypertrophy, increased thickness. Now again, this demonstrative is showing a more severe example of hypertrophy. Mr. Ellis had a mild case of left ventricular hypertrophy.
And do you have an opinion as to whether or not that condition was the sole cause of his death?
Yes, I do have an opinion.
And what's your opinion?
It was not the cause of his death.
All right, you can take your seat again if you'd like. Going back to the pre-hospital report, Exhibit 24, if we could. In the pre-hospital report, in the narrative section, you see that the paramedic who prepared it indicated cardiac arrest secondary to excited delirium. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not the paramedic's statement that this was cardiac arrest secondary to excited delirium is accurate?
I do have an opinion.
And what's your opinion?
An objective foundation was not included in the report.
Overruled, you may answer.
My opinion is that Mr. Ellis's cardiac arrest was not due to excited delirium.
And can you explain why that's your opinion?
Well, excited delirium is not an accepted diagnosis or cause of death. None of the major medical organizations have accepted it. The American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association, American Medical Association, World Health Organization, none of these organizations have accepted this as a diagnosis. And it's a diagnosis based on behavior, not looking at underlying physiology or pathology. To look at cardiac arrest, as we've been doing, you need to look at all of the factors in the person's history, the immediate situation prior to the cardiac arrest, looking at the EKG patterns as we've been doing, and we've been discussing how that assists in the differential diagnosis. To simply attribute cause of death to excited delirium, to a behavior pattern that doesn't even have any defined type of criteria, that's just not accepted. That's pseudoscience. That's not a medical analysis that has any justification or basis.
So going back to the LifePack data, Exhibit 2739, is there anything about any of the data that you see for Mr. Ellis's heart there that would be consistent or suggest that this was excited delirium cardiac arrest?
So again, as cardiologists, we don't recognize that whole diagnosis as a cause of cardiac arrest. To the extent that someone's excited or delirious, that would be a stimulated kind of environment. You would expect to see a rapid heart rate, and remember what we saw initially was a slower heart rate. So there's no connection there. And again, this is a diagnosis that has been debunked. It's no longer accepted. I can tell you in California, where I'm from, it's actually banned from being...
Well, we're not in California.
Correct.
I think he's made his point. I'll allow the answer to stand.
Doctor, I want to ask you about something called, and if we could go back to 2739, please. This is the LifePack data. I want to ask you if you could speed forward to 12:02 approximately. Are you familiar with torsade?
Yes,
I don't know how to say the rest of it. But,
yes.
And can you take a look, and maybe you can step down here if you'd like, but can you tell the jury, is there a torsade rhythm anywhere here on Mr. Ellis's life pack data?
No, the answer is no.
And what is the torsades? Can you just explain what it is?
So it's a French term, and so it's torsade, Torsades, and then the rest of the term is torsade de pointe, Pointes. So it literally means twisting of the points. So it's a form of ventricular tachycardia. We showed that before, and the twisting of the points means that the spike on the EKG changes direction. Sometimes it's pointing down, sometimes it's pointing up. It's a form of ventricular tachycardia. I didn't see anything on any of the tracings here that would meet criteria for torsade, Torsades.
And when you looked at the pre-hospital care report, was there any mention in the pre-hospital care report prepared by paramedic Wilson that indicated he believed there was a torsade rhythm here?
No.
All right, you said that Mr. Ellis's death was due to respiratory arrest, not to methamphetamine or underlying cardiac conditions. Can you just explain why it's a respiratory issue and not a cardiac issue?
Yes.
Asked and answered. He stated this at least.
I think he has said this.
I'll move on. Doctor, if you can assume that Mr. Ellis had a pulse all the way up to the point that CPR was started, does that change your opinion in any way?
No.
Why not?
Because the sequence of rhythm disorders, the atrial fibrillation, then asystole, and then continued atrial fibrillation with pulselessness, meaning pulseless electrical activity, are absolutely all consistent with hypoxia, causing cardiac arrest. They are inconsistent with methamphetamine, inconsistent with underlying cardiac disease, causing the cardiac arrest. So everything fits for this being restraint, asphyxia, causing hypoxia, causing cardiac arrest.
I can have just a moment. That's all I have. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Mr. Purcher?
Yes, thank you. Doctor, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I just kind of start with, you provided a list of items that you reviewed. It's Exhibit 2742, I think you provided to the state today. Do you need a copy of that for your review?
Yes, please.
Okay, perhaps, where you find folks to put up 2742? Just for his view. You give it to us. Yeah, yes,
Okay.
all right.
So make sure we're on the same
We're on
page.
the same page. Doctor, do you have it there?
Yes.
Great. And so I want to go through the items that you reviewed for purposes of your opinion today. And just so we all understand, there's a report that you generated here some time ago, and as I understand your testimony, your opinion has not changed based on additional material that you may have reviewed since the initial documents were provided to you. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, very good. And so with respect to what you did review, in this, you reviewed the supplemental, both the full and the supplemental toxicology reports,
Yes.
and that was establishing the methamphetamine level of the 2,400 nanograms per milliliter. correct?
Yes.
You reviewed the reports from various paramedics that appeared at the scene, correct?
Yes.
You reviewed the autopsy photos,
Yes.
medical examiner's diagram,
Yes.
the medical examiner's autopsy reports,
Yes.
and supplemental reports.
Yes.
You talked about the pre-hospital care report that was Exhibit 24, which you reviewed.
Yes.
Then Nicholas Wilson, you reviewed the AG's recorded interview of him.
Yes.
You looked at the synced video prepared by Grant Fredericks.
Yes.
You reviewed the McDowell, Lowry, and Cowden statements, correct?
Yes.
And going back to the video, the Grant Fredericks video included McDowell, Lowry, and Cowden's videos, correct?
Yes.
Or actually, more appropriately, McDowell and Cowden's videos.
Yes.
And then you reviewed Officer Ford and Officer Rankin's statements.
Yes.
And then also Sergeant Nacinio and Sergeant Sanders' statements.
Yes.
Correct? Was there any other material, aside from the expert reports that you reviewed subsequently, that you reviewed for purposes of this case?
I don't see, oh, you have Rankin, Officer Rankin, yes. No, I think that covers it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, and these items, as I understand, were provided to you by the Attorney General's office or the Attorney General's involved in the case?
Yes.
That they did not provide you with any other law enforcement reports aside from what you received from Ford, Rankin, Nacinio, and Sanders?
Correct.
So
And
the,
I'm gonna object, I mean, these are documents primarily relied upon, not all documents provided.
well, he can answer the questions.
Well, I just think it's not accurate what's being suggested here,
I'm suggesting.
based on the document.
Overall,
Doctor, you did not receive any other law enforcement reports aside from those four that I referred to, correct?
I don't specifically recall.
Okay. You didn't receive anything from the Pierce County Sheriff's Department?
I don't specifically recall.
You didn't receive any reports from the Washington State Patrol?
No, not that I recall.
In particular, Trooper Jones, his report?
Oh, yes, I did receive a report from Trooper Jones. Yes. Yes, I did. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, very good. You didn't receive any statements from Officers Burbank or Collins?
No, I recall testimony about Officers Burbank and Collins. I don't recall statements from Officers Burbank and Collins.
And you did not receive any statements from Shad Hayes,
Not that I recall.
Kenneth Smith,
Not that I recall.
Ayanna Smith,
Not that I recall.
or videos, some cell phone videos from Ayanna Smith?
Not that I recall.
But what you have reviewed is what you formed the basis of your opinion.
Yes.
Now, with respect to your opinions, you got your report with you, Doctor?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. You had an opportunity to review the pathology report prepared by Dr. Clark
Yes.
and also the supplemental report.
Yes.
And as I understand your testimony, you stated on page 3 of your report, I fundamentally agree with Dr. Clark's assessment and opinions as detailed in his supplemental report.
Yes.
And in his supplemental report, which he received a little bit additional information about the officer interaction with Mr. Ellis, correct?
Yes.
But his primary statement, in his opinion, was that the methamphetamine concentration is well within the fatal range and could have caused this death independently, correct?
Yes.
And also, there was the heart issue that you testified about, correct?
Yes.
And there was also the final statement in there that he relates the contributing factors of both methamphetamine, intoxication, and dilated heart, correct?
Yes.
And to the suggestion of progressive autopsy. Correct?
I'm looking to see,
Page 2 of actually his initial report, if you have it.
I don't have his initial report with me
Okay,
yet.
let's get that, let's make this straightforward.
Do you know what number it is?
Right. 250. Doctor, excuse me 1 second. Judge, somebody hid the binder. I think it's right up here. No, it's not right up here.
So it's 250 and also I think there's some 551. That's what I know.
We will find it. Thank you. Dr. Henning was marked as 2654. And this has Dr. Clark's reports and some other materials. Good to go.
Thank you.
And Dr., I'm on page 2 of his report.
Yes,
All right. And then he talks about both the methamphetamine intoxication, the fatal level, correct?
yes,
The dilated heart.
yes.
In that, in his last sentence in that report is that furthermore, an argument could be made that the extremely high methamphetamine concentration should be considered the primary factor in Mr. Ellis's death.
Yes,
And you accepted his post-mortem examination report as the stepping stone apparently for your report, correct?
well, I viewed his supplemental report in conjunction with the primary autopsy report, and I also provided my independent opinions
Sure.
regarding these issues.
But he never, Dr. Clark never stepped away from both the dilated heart and the methamphetamine as being potential causes of Mr. Ellis's death, correct?
Well, I'm not sure how you define step away. I think there is a modifier that he puts in his supplemental report that reduces the emphasis significantly on methamphetamine as the culprit.
Well, he said that methamphetamine is still at least at a minimum a contributing factor in this death.
I have your statement in mind. Yes, he does list it as a contributing factor.
But you have stated to the jury that under no certain circumstances is methamphetamine involved at all in Mr. Ellis's death.
No, that's
I withdraw.
no, that mischaracterizes my testimony.
Okay?
I said that methamphetamine created a heightened oxygen requirement,
Okay?
which made Mr. Ellis more vulnerable to the impact of having decreased oxygen availability as a result of the restraint asphyxia.
Okay? Mr. Ellis ingested the methamphetamine.
Yes,
None of the three authors here assisted Mr. Ellis in ingesting methamphetamine.
I agree.
His level was toxic.
Yes,
And toxins can cause death, can they not?
theoretically and hypothetically, yes.
Okay? And the level of methamphetamine in Mr. Ellis's blood could cause the death instantaneously, correct?
It could, theoretically, but as I've discussed, the nature of his cardiac arrest, the information we have available regarding the EKG patterns is not consistent with methamphetamine as the cause of death.
My question is that the toxic level of methamphetamine in itself could cause the death of Mr. Ellis.
Yes.
And his dilated heart in and of itself could cause his death.
Theoretically, it could, but I've given explanations why I do not think that it was the cause.
And he had not just a toxic level of methamphetamine, he had the dilated heart.
Yes.
Correct? Nothing that any of these three police officers had anything to do with.
Correct.
All right. And his dilated heart was as a result of his chronic methamphetamine use.
Most likely, yes.
Okay? And you stated that the examples that you had are not illustrative of Mr. Ellis's heart back on the time when the autopsy was done in March of 2020.
What I said was it illustrates a condition, but the nature of his condition was not as severe as the illustrations depicted.
You didn't take a look at Mr. Ellis's heart, did you?
No.
You relied on the other reports in the autopsy to deal with this, correct?
Correct.
Now, with respect to Mr. Ellis's condition at the time of Benno's death, we need to put this in kind of spatial terms. When do you have an understanding as to when Mr. Ellis came into contact with the police officers in this case?
I don't have the exact time. It was obviously in late night on March the 3rd of 2020.
Roughly 11:30 that night.
Yes.
Okay. Do you have an understanding of how long he was involved with Officers Burbank and Collins before he was restrained?
When you say involved, I'm not certain what that
How
would.
long before they had him under, he was apprehended?
I don't have the precise timeline.
Do you have a general time?
Yeah, under 10 minutes.
Okay, under 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And so, if in fact it was like 2 minutes, would that have any material difference with respect to your opinion?
No.
Okay. What part of what Officer Burbank did caused Mr. Ellis to become hypoxic, aside from the physical struggle between himself and Mr. Ellis?
By physical struggle, you're including the fact that the Officer Burbank, was on Mr. Ellis's back.
Well, no, I'm asking you, what specifically did Officer Burbank do to Mr. Ellis?
He restrained him.
Okay, he restrained him because Mr. Ellis was resisting arrest.
I don't know the definition of resisting arrest, so I won't get into that legal terminology.
So you don't know whether Mr. Ellis was resisting arrest?
I didn't analyze the case from that standpoint.
Okay. And so there was an altercation between Officer Burbank and Officer Collins and Mr. Ellis for a period of time, correct?
Yes.
And is it your position and your understanding that Officer Burbank and or Officer Collins were on Mr. Ellis's back?
Yes.
Okay, and where did you get that information?
From Officer Rankin's testimony?
From Officer Rankin's testimony?
Yes.
Okay, and how long was Officer Burbank and or Officer Collins on Mr. Ellis's back?
I don't have a specific quantity of time.
Okay. When the officers, Burbank and Collins, handcuffed Mr. Ellis, how many other police officers were present at that point in time?
I'm going to object, this is outside his expertise, my foundation.
Going to the basis of knowledge.
Doesn't go to his medical opinions.
Go directly.
Well, it seems to me there's a point to be made here about a couple of things. That if the doctor's opinion is correct, that this was caused by a kind of positional asphyxia, there would still have to be some consideration given for and that this was affected by the existing conditions of the methamphetamine use and the dilated heart. And there would still have to be some consideration of, given the struggle, is he assuming, and the struggle has been also a part of the need to have additional oxygen, is the doctor assuming that the entirety of the struggle was somehow improper, I guess, and or at some point when the struggle was over, at what point would it be that Mr. Ellis would be unable to recover? I mean, we know that he was, by the testimony of the doctor here, that applying the oxygen to Mr. Ellis at the time the medical folks arrived, it was, as he put it, over the cliff by then. It was too late. When would it have not been too late? And so it seems to me some evaluation of the struggle and its reference to that point in time bears on the opinion. So for that reason, I'll permit inquiry into this kind of thing. So, objection overruled. You may continue.
So, doctor, do you know how many people, how many law enforcement officers were involved in the actual apprehension of Mr. Ellis? That's the first question.
The answer is no, and I'd like to clarify, with your permission, Your Honor. You mentioned,
Hold on a second. Counsel can very quick.
Secondly, at what point in time was Mr. Ellis no longer able to recover from this physical event with the police officers, all of them?
so we only know what actually transpired. I can't create a hypothetical as to whether a minute earlier would have made a difference or a minute later. That's speculative.
Well, what about 5 minutes earlier?
It's speculative.
So you don't know?
I don't know.
Fair enough. All right. So we have first of all, we have the physical struggle between Mr. Ellis and the police officers, however many were involved, correct?
Correct.
And he was apprehended at a point in time, correct?
Yes.
And then eventually, medical staff arrived to address Mr. Ellis.
Yes.
Okay? And we know that the hypoxic condition, just the hypoxia, was started as a result of the physical altercation when his resisting arrest from Officer Burbank and Collins, correct?
Yes.
His need for oxygen was increased due to his toxic level of methamphetamine.
Yes.
It was increased due to he had an enlarged heart.
Yes.
He had been tased,
Yes.
and you said that that causes pain,
Yes.
and that can increase the need for oxygen.
Yes.
He was also obese,
Yes.
and he also had a spit hood plaque.
Yes.
So those 6 different factors all affected Mr. Ellis's need for oxygen.
Well, I would say that the spit hood affects supply of oxygen, not so much need for oxygen.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, that would reduce apparently the ability for him to get oxygen.
Correct.
All right, so that has to have a direct impact on his ability to breathe.
Yes.
That's your understanding?
Yes.
Okay. And so you indicated that in the process, let's try that. When medical staff arrived, they came to see Mr. Ellis on the ground, correct?
Yes.
All right. Do you recall how Mr. Ellis was positioned at the time medical staff arrived?
I believe at that point he was on his back.
Okay, and so he's on his back,
Yes.
and is he still in restraints?
Yes.
Okay, so he's no longer in the prone position,
Correct.
and that was one of the criticisms you had, is that he was prone on the ground, handcuffed, correct?
Yes,
And then had weight on him in some fashion.
yes,
And so, getting beyond that, when medical staff arrived, he's no longer prone, correct?
correct.
All right. And do you recall how long it was between the time of Mr. Ellis becoming apprehended until medical arrived?
So I believe the medical arrived at 23:34, and so from the apprehension time, I didn't have the exact time, but so we're talking about 12 minutes or so.
Okay, so in that 12-minute period of time, Mr. Ellis has been restrained, correct?
Yes,
He's restrained with the hobbles, correct?
yes.
All right, and then how many different times was he placed in the recovery position from the time that he was apprehended until medical staff arrived?
He was placed on his side once.
One time?
Yes,
And for how long?
I don't know.
And you indicated that he was, there was weight on him.
Yes,
How much?
don't know.
Okay, does it make a difference?
Well, it makes a difference in the more weight there is, the more compression there is, but we don't have any knowledge about how much compressive force there was.
So we know for certain that there was a period of time that he was hobbled
Yes,
and restrained behind his back.
yes.
There was a person that had some weight on him, but we don't know the amount.
It was more than a person, it was,
So there was multiple people.
yes.
How many people were on Mr. Ellis's back?
Well, initially, it was Officer Burbank on his back and Officer Collins restraining his legs. And then Officer Rankin took over for Officer Burbank.
When in time did Officer Rankin take over for Officer Burbank?
I don't have that information.
So that wasn't provided.
No.
Okay. And so after Officer Rankin was on his back, how much time passed from the time that Officer Rankin got on his back until medical arrived?
I don't have that information.
Okay, and so, just so we're clear, you don't have that information, and you cannot say by reasonable scientific, reasonable medical certainty that that period of time had any effect on Mr. Ellis's passing.
I'm not certain what you're referring to as that period of time.
The time between when Officer Rankin got on his back, as you understand,
Right.
and the time when the medical staff arrived.
Yeah, I'm not making any individual assignment of causative effect here. I don't have that ability to make that assessment.
So just so we're clear, you're saying he died because of positional asphyxiation,
Yes.
but you don't know when that occurred.
Oh, yes, I know when it occurred. I don't know when it occurred relative to which officer being involved in restraining him.
When was it irreversible?
I think we've asked this and answered it already. I can't make an assignment as to what time that would be. We know in this case that it was irreversible, but I can't make a assignment as to what time it would have been different.
And you can't say what, if any, officer or officers were involved at the time that it became irreversible?
Correct.
Doctor, in Exhibit 24, and if you can put that up for the doctor. And also, the life pack exhibit. Okay, we'll need 2739 shortly. And if you could blow this one up a bit so we can take a look at it. Great. Doctor, you said this is one of the reports that you reviewed previously.
Yes.
And just so we're kind of on the same page here, the narrative is, I guess, the general information the paramedic received in the first paragraph.
Yes.
Second paragraph is what he did, or what was done for Mr. Ellis when he arrived.
Yes.
Okay. And so it states that in the, when they arrived, and UE10 being engine 10, they said the restraints, bulky clothing, stiffly removed with rapid patient assessment. Correct?
Yes.
Right. And do you know what, if anything, Lieutenant Wilson assessed at the time that he initially arrived?
Respiratory rate, pulse, and mental status.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the respiratory rate, he was breathing at the time, correct?
Yes,
Was his heart beating at the time?
yes,
Okay, so he had a heart rate and he's breathing, correct?
yes, but weak, ineffective respirations, I think, is how Mr. Wilson described it in
Well, he
his.
said it was weak and thready. He didn't say it was necessarily ineffective.
Weak and thready, I think, was referring to the pulse. I thought the description of the respirations was, he used the word
I'm
ineffective.
sorry, you're correct. Yeah, his pulse was weak and thready. His respiration was ineffective.
Okay, thank you.
And that's why they put the bag valve mask on, correct?
Yes,
And so there is a pulse that Mr. Ellis has, and they put the valve, the mask on, correct?
yes.
All right. And that was on him for how long?
I don't have that information.
Okay. You indicated that Mr. Ellis was in this, the pulseless electrical activity.
Yes.
When did that start?
Well, the rhythm that's first detected is an EKG rhythm, so there is electrical activity. Mr. Wilson, in testimony that he gave, as I understand it, indicated that initially there was still a detectable pulse, and then he developed asystole, and at that point was pulseless, and CPR was started. The subsequent EKG showed pulseless electrical activity.
Okay. So he had a pulse for at least 4 minutes once Lieutenant Wilson started treating. correct?
According to Lieutenant Wilson's testimony, yes.
And pursuant to Exhibit 24, correct?
Well, we'd have to go into the timeline, I think,
Go to the
too.
second page, please. Doctor, oops, too far. Go back to, right there. Okay, 23:36:53, the bag valve mask is used on Mr. Ellis, correct?
Yes,
And then at 23:41:11, CPR started.
yes,
So actually, it's roughly 3.5, 4 minutes, correct?
yes,
That he has a pulse, correct?
yes,
And he's being assisted by the bag valve.
yes.
Now, do you recall or do you know how long it was between the time that medical staff arrived until they actually started treating Mr. Ellis?
It was a few minutes, I don't have the exact timeline, yeah.
Okay, so a couple of minutes,
Yeah.
they arrived at the scene, and a couple of minutes later, they started to apply treatment to Mr. Ellis.
Yes,
Okay? And so from that point forward, they treated him, and unfortunately, Mr. Ellis passed away, correct?
yes,
And within the report, the paramedic states that there was a run of pulseless VTAC with DFib, correct?
yes.
What's that referred to?
So after Mr. Ellis was given epinephrine to treat pulseless electrical activity and asystole, he developed ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation, and the appropriate treatment for that is defibrillation electric shock.
And the DFib, that's fatal, I think is what you said.
VFib is fatal, yes. Defib is the electric shock, defibrillation, yes.
VTAC can be fatal as well.
Yes,
All right. And so it was after the epinephrine was started that the VTAC developed.
correct.
All right. Are you saying that the epinephrine caused the VTAC?
Well, in the context of his having had a preceding cardiac arrest, so I'm not saying the epinephrine caused it on its own, because we're talking about somebody where they're trying to resuscitate him. So I will say that the ventricular tachycardia was part of the evolution of the cardiac arrest, and that was a function of his having gotten epinephrine.
Okay? And the function of the cardiac arrest was his size. Mr. Ellis is obese.
I'm sorry, so you said the function of his cardiac arrest, I didn't
No, I'm
understand.
sorry. You said that there was a function of his, I believe you said that was the cardiac arrest or the VTAC was a function of the treatment provided to it.
I think I said it's part of the evolution of the cardiac arrest process, yes.
All right, and just so we're clear.
Yeah.
The cardiac arrest, in your opinion, was from the initially started with the restraint,
Correct.
correct? But actually started when the methamphetamine was ingested.
Well, he didn't have a cardiac arrest until after the restraint. I mean, when he first was encountered, he was walking and moving and certainly not in a state of cardiac arrest. So he had methamphetamine on board at that time, but he was fully functional and active, and actually there was an encounter. So the cardiac arrest didn't occur until after the prone restraint.
Okay, he was fully functional. What described fully functional?
He was moving, walking, talking, breathing. I'm not saying that he was, behaving normally, but he certainly did not have any evidence of a cardiac arrest.
The moving and the talking, and that was obtained from what source that he was speaking?
Let's see. So if we go back to the beginning of if we can scroll back on this document where the history is obtained. So in the narrative, the first paragraph, patient charging vehicles was apparent threat, patient tased and restrained, then went limp. Prior to going limp was very strong. I agree it doesn't say anything about speaking, but he clearly is active, moving. This is not consistent with a cardiac arrest.
Okay, would you, well, cardiac arrest is the final result, correct? From your opinion, he died as having a heart attack.
No, he did not have a heart attack. We know from autopsy there was no evidence of a heart attack. Cardiac arrest and heart attack are not synonymous. Heart attack is when there's damage to heart muscle, typically due to a blocked heart artery. We know he did not have blocked heart arteries. He did not have damage of his heart muscle consistent with a heart attack. Cardiac arrest is when the heart stops functioning. So he had a cardiac arrest. And again, it is my opinion, as we've discussed, that was due to prone restraint, asphyxia, causing hypoxia.
But you don't know when that occurred specifically.
Well, I know when he had the cardiac arrest and lost pulse. We've already discussed that, yes. So,
Well, you know when he had the cardiac arrest, that was, 40 minutes, or it was at least 10 minutes after law enforcement was no longer in contact, correct?
so he had, that's when he,
Questions, yes or no response?
yes.
Judge, this would be a good time to take a break.
Does our normal breaking time in about 30 seconds, so sure. Go ahead and take your break. So our afternoon break for 15 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. Please do not discuss the case among yourselves with anyone else.
40% plaintiff, 60% defense.
Okay, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
that's the medical malpractice area.
Yes.
All right. With respect to in-custody death cases, how many of those have you done?
So not all of the in-custody cases were death cases. I think 2 of them resulted in injury but not death. So total number is 10 to 12. I don't have the exact number of cases.
10 to 12 were the past 40 years.
Yeah, so the custody cases really just started 6, 7 years ago.
Okay. That area of in-custody death, when you have controlled substances and other type of medical issues, and then you have an opinion regarding the cause of death, is a pretty complicated area. Would you agree?
Yes.
And there are not, I'll strike that, there are differing opinions that occur with respect to these types of cases regarding the cause of death.
Yes.
And we have differences of opinion in this particular case.
Yes.
Now, in the cases that you've done, I understand this is the only time you've been involved in a criminal case.
Yes.
What is the breakdown of your cases otherwise in custody death cases?
They were all civil cases. They were all referred to me by plaintiff's attorneys.
Okay, so plaintiffs, you've been a quote plaintiff's expert in these types of cases thus far.
Yes.
Now, Doctor, in the report that you generated, you referenced both the asystole, is that the correct pronunciation?
Yes, it is. Yes.
And PEA.
Yes.
And in this particular case, we have, again, we have the methamphetamine toxicity that Mr. Ellis suffered from,
Yes.
the bad heart.
Well, there was some disease of the heart. Whether you'd call it a bad heart is subjective. Yeah. Yeah.
That's my subjective.
Okay,
A
yeah.
diseased heart.
Yes.
Okay. He was obese.
Yes.
All right. He was involved in a vigorous event with law enforcement.
Yes.
Okay. And it was the constellation of all those factors that, as I understand it, ultimately led to his death.
Well, you're not mentioning the prone restraint, are
I'm
you?
sorry, and the prone restraint
okay.
ultimately led to his death.
Yes.
All right. And with respect to the actual prone restraint, I think as you testified, you don't know how long he was prone, don't know how long he had weight, and if there was weight, how much weight he had on him.
Well, I think there is testimony regarding the duration of time that he was in prone restraint.
Well, but the officers specifically involved in having him in a prone restraint, do you know what the duration was for each of those officers?
No, I don't.
And that was not provided to you?
Correct.
Now, also in your report, you reference that, that in a system, that's basically flat line,
Yes.
okay? And there's both, as I understand it, both primary or secondary asystole,
Yes.
correct? And primary, maybe if you could describe to the jury better than I certainly would, the difference between the two.
Yes.
Would you please do that?
Sure. Primary asystole is when there is disease of the electrical conducting system, those biological wires in yellow that we saw going through the heart. And that can be due to someone having had multiple heart attacks, that the areas of damage incorporated the electrical system. So the electrical system basically has been knocked out. Another condition is pretty much an age-related degeneration of the electrical system. You know, as we get older, some of our body parts give out. We have to, people have to get knee replacements, hip replacements, and sometimes they need pacemakers because the electrical system has no longer functioning. So that's primary asystole.
And Dr. Mustafa, that is not involved in this particular.
That's correct. That is not at all relevant to this case. Secondary asystole occurs when factors outside of the heart's electrical conduction system result in a failure to generate any electrical activity. So it's not anything structural in the heart, it's something in the environment of the heart. Not enough oxygen, too much acid, very high levels of potassium, hypothermia, some conditions that are independent of the heart, but that can cause this paralysis of the electrical conduction system of the heart.
And of those different examples or conditions, narcosis narcotic overdoses can also be a cause of asystole.
Yes, as I mentioned in the report, narcotic overdoses like fentanyl resulting in respiratory failure can lead to secondary asystole.
Yeah, you didn't say fentanyl, you said narcotic overdose.
No, but I just gave you the example, but narcotic overdoses leading to respiratory failure. So, yeah, can cause asystole.
Methamphetamine would be a narcotic, would it not?
No, it is not. It's a stimulant. Yeah.
Not narcotic.
No.
And then PEA, you gave references to PEA and what can cause PEA, correct?
Yes.
And there was a variety of factors that you included. One you didn't include is that of toxins.
Yes.
And methamphetamine would be a toxin, correct?
Well, methamphetamine can be called a toxin, but it's not the type of toxin that causes PEA.
This doesn't differentiate the types of toxins, does it?
No, that doesn't, but if you review the literature, you'll see that methamphetamine does not cause PEA, and Dr. Clark in his supplemental report also acknowledged that methamphetamine does not cause PEA.
But Dr. Clark did acknowledge that methamphetamine should still be considered the primary source of Mr. Ellis's death, correct?
That states that.
Overruled.
So, reading from the supplemental report, and this is verbatim quote from Dr. Clark, methamphetamine intoxication cannot be completely excluded as the cause of death, but the probability is low. So that's his quote. So I don't think that's consistent with your conclusion that Dr. Clark was saying that methamphetamine is the likely cause of the cardiac arrest.
He didn't exclude it.
He did not completely exclude it, correct?
Well, he didn't exclude it, whether it's completely or incomplete, he did not exclude methamphetamine.
Well, completely is his word, not my word, yes. Yeah.
But this is a report that you relied upon in your analysis, is correct?
Yes, but I didn't rely exclusively on this report. I offered my own opinions in addition to the opinions provided by Dr. Clark.
Understood, and we already got across that reason minds could differ regarding the cause of Mr. Ellis's death in this particular case, correct?
Yes.
And with respect to just the fact that Mr. Ellis had this 2,400 nanograms per milliliter of methamphetamine in his system, without any involvement with law enforcement, without a diseased heart, that in and of itself could have killed him, correct?
So we've discussed this before, and I acknowledge that it can theoretically cause death, but the cause of death would be ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation, which did not occur here at the time of cardiac arrest.
Thank you for advocacy, and
Yeah.
asking a question. It could cause sudden death, correct? Methamphetamine.
As a hypothetical, yes.
And heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States, correct?
Yes.
And Mr. Ellis had a diseased heart, correct?
Yes.
He'd had a history of heart issues over the years, correct?
Well, his heart issues over the years were a different problem. He had a inflammation around the heart called pericarditis, which is not a lethal disorder.
But he had heart issues over a period of time. correct?
Yes.
Complained of chest pain,
Yes.
and that persisted for 10 plus years.
Yes.
So Mr. Ellis, unfortunately, was obese.
Yes.
He had a diseased heart.
Yes.
He had a toxic level of methamphetamine in his system.
Yes.
He resisted the arrest by law enforcement officers.
I'm not contesting that, but I'm not offering opinions about the interaction with law enforcement.
Law enforcement found it necessary to not just restrain him, but to put him into a hollow, correct?
Yes, and I'm not offering any opinions regarding police procedure or what was done and why it was done. That's not my role here. Yeah.
I fully understand, but
Yeah.
that's where he found himself.
Yes.
And even after he was hobbled, he was still fighting, trying to fight it, period. Correct?
Well, I mean, he was trying to get people who were sitting on his back off his back.
Well,
That's struggling to live. That's not fighting.
he
Yeah.
was struggling,
Yeah.
period. And he was put in a recovery position, correct?
Yes.
And he started struggling again, correct?
Yes,
And officers had to restrain him again.
yes,
And that was witnessed by several police officers outside of the 3 individuals that are charged here, correct?
yes,
And so throughout that period of time, he was continuing to struggle even though he was restrained.
yes,
And that would lead to the acidosis, I believe it is, that you said, that person experienced.
yes.
Excuse me, just one second. Doctor, thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you.
Doctor, your email address is drdan@iheartdrdan.com, is that right?
Yes,
How long you had that email address?
good question. I think 4 years.
And do you know Julie Sherwin?
Julia Sherwin? Yes, yes.
Who's that?
She's an attorney.
Right, and you worked as an expert on a case with her involving Humberto Martinez, is that right?
Yes,
On that case, a Dr. Michael Freeman also worked on that case with you, right?
yes.
And Dr. Freeman has been hired by the AG's office in this case as well, right?
I understand that he has, yes.
And Jack Ryan, a police use of force expert, also worked on that Humberto Martinez case with you and Dr. Freeman, right?
I don't specifically recall. I didn't interact with the police procedures expert.
And you know that Jack Ryan's been hired by the Attorney General's office in this case as well.
I did not know that.
This Humberto Martinez case is an individual who died in police custody, right?
Yes.
He suffered 16 fractured ribs, right?
You know, I don't,
Oh, it's gonna be relevant.
I'll allow a little leeway here. We'll see how relevant this is.
okay, I don't have specific recollection of the details of that case and didn't review the records of that case in preparation for today's testimony.
Well, you offered an expert opinion in that case, did you not?
Yes, but that was a few years ago and I haven't reviewed those records.
About positional asphyxia causing the death of Mr. Martinez, right?
Yes,
Doctor, you certainly would not offer an opinion in this case without having first, this case being Mr. Ellis's case, without first reviewing the discovery, right?
before reviewing, I don't understand the question.
Well, you certainly wouldn't offer an opinion about positional asphyxia causing hypoxia without reviewing medical records related to Mr. Ellis in this case, right?
Correct,
Reports related to the contact between law enforcement and Mr. Ellis, right?
correct.
His medical history,
Yes,
his toxicology report,
correct,
or officer statements, right?
correct.
All right. With the court's permission, I'm going to show you what's been marked as defendant's 2740. May I approach, Judge?
Sure.
Take a look at that document and tell me if you recognize that document.
This is a series of emails between Attorney Patty Eakes and myself. And there is, at the beginning of the chain is an email from Attorney Julia Sherwin addressed to Patty Eakes, and I'm one of those copied on the email.
Right? You were included on this email between Julia Sherwin, the attorney in California that you testified in the Humberto Martinez case, right?
Yes,
Julia Sherwin emails Ms. Eakes, who's the attorney general in this case, right?
yes,
And in the body of that email, which is dated June 2nd of 2021, that's the date of it, right?
yes.
Julia Sherwin suggests that you're going to testify a certain way in this case before you even had any discovery, right?
Well, what she says is that Dan Wogelernter, cardiologist, can testify. She doesn't say he will testify. And of course, I wouldn't have anyone dictate to me what I would say or not say.
Well, go ahead and read the rest of the paragraph. You can testify testify to what?
That Mr. Ellis's enlarged heart would not have killed him, and if any EKG or rhythm strips show pulseless electrical activity, that he was suffering from hypoxia, the most frequent cause of PEA is hypoxia, and if the death were by meth intoxication, the expected rhythm would be ventricular tachycardia.
So in the email on June 2nd of 2021, Julia Sherwin is suggesting to Patty Eakes, the Attorney General in this case, that you can testify to what you testified here today before seeing any documents related to this case, right?
So I didn't author this email, and this wasn't
That was
sent.
my question. That's what she said in the email, right?
Yeah, so you can ask Julia Sherwin about why she wrote this email. I didn't author this
Go
email.
to page 1, Doctor.
Yes.
Page 1, you respond and say, hey, can we meet on a specific date and discuss my working on this case, right?
Yes.
And you didn't dispute what Julia Sherwin said in the email about what you could testify to, did you?
I didn't dispute it, but I didn't confirm it. I didn't say I'm going to sign me up. I'm going to testify along the lines of what she said.
And Julia Sherwin attached your report as it related to Humberto Martinez as evidence of what you would testify to if these things were present, right?
I was not aware of that.
Well, go to the last page. It says attachment, expert report, general manager, MD, right?
I don't see that.
Fate stamps at the bottom. Washington Attorney General 0102703. See the fate stamps at the bottom of the pages?
Wait, so what number are you saying in?
Oh, yours has different numbers than mine. All right, well, you have another one marked. And before we get to your expert report on Mr. Martinez, in that same email from Julia Sherwin to Ms. Eakes, there's a paragraph about Michael Freeman and what he would testify to in this case, right?
Yes.
Including debunking excited delirium in the death of Manny Ellis, right?
Yes.
And then also Jack Ryan, indicating that Jack Ryan would testify to police practices in this case as well, right?
I'm not seeing that.
Directly below the paragraph where she says what you're going to testify to.
Okay, it says Jack Ryan, police practices. It doesn't say what he's going to say. Yes. Okay, yeah.
That's what judge was now 2744.
So this is now 2744.
Correct.
And I take it it's the same email chain, but there's like another page on it.
It's got the attachments associated with it. 2744, doctor. At the bottom of that, it has the attachments, which include, I think, Exhibit 25 from your work on Humberto Martinez's case, right?
So it says I attached their reports, doesn't specify me by name. I have no knowledge whether my report was attached or not.
Well, doctor, doesn't it say at the bottom, attachment expert report, Daniel Wolgan,
Yeah.
doctor?
Yeah, I'm not sure I noticed it then, and I didn't notice it now.
Okay, and that would be the report you authored with respect to the Humberto Martinez case, right?
I assume so, yes.
I believe Mr. Conrad can ask some questions about that, but you provided that report to Julia Sherwin, who then provided it to the AG's office in this case, right?
So I did not authorize the report to be sent to the Attorney General office here. The report was provided by me to Julia Sherwin. You can ask Julia Sherwin as to why she forwarded the report to Attorney Eakes.
But you see that that's been attached to the email between.
Now that you've pointed it out, yes.
Okay, all right. And that email, at least the chain started on June 2nd of 2021, correct?
Yes.
If we go back to 2740, the first exhibit I handed you,
Yes.
you actually respond. When do you respond to try to coordinate a meeting with Ms. Eakes?
June the 2nd.
All right, so on the same day that Julia Sherwin says you can testify to these things, you then reach out and seek a meeting with Ms. Eakes to determine if you can testify to this case, right?
Yes.
I thought you didn't solicit cases, that's what you told us this morning.
I didn't contact Attorney Eakes or Attorney Sherwin to solicit the case. I was introduced and copied, and as a result of that, I reached out to Patty Eakes.
And on June 15th, 13 days after you reached out to Patty Eakes, you entered into a contract with the Attorney General's office in this case, right?
I don't remember the specific date, but I'm not contesting it.
And in that contract, you agreed to an hourly rate of $550 an hour to consult in this case, right?
Yes,
And a specific rate of $750 an hour for interviews or depositions, right?
yes,
$4,800 for a half day of testimony, right?
yes,
And $9,600 for a full day of testimony at trial, right?
yes.
How much have you invoiced the Attorney General's office for your participation in this case to date?
I don't have that number.
Well, how many hours have you worked on this case?
I don't have that number either.
Can you estimate for us?
No. I know I provided invoices at the time of my interview. Bless you. But I don't have a up-to-date tally.
You entered into a second contract with the Attorney General's office on February 1st of 2022, is that right?
Yes,
And both those contracts set a maximum compensation of $50,000 per contract, right?
yeah, I didn't establish that number. That was provided by the Attorney General's office.
But you can't estimate to us how much you're going to bill the state for your participation in this case? Just
No,
figure?
no,
More than $50,000?
I don't think so, no.
It was only after you entered into that contract on June 15th of 2022 that you received any materials related to this case, right?
Yes.
When did you first receive those, do you know?
Let me look at my report. I don't have the specific date. It was sometime in June of 2021, but I don't have the specific date.
And do you have the specific date that you actually authored your report? I don't have it in front of me.
February 13, 2022.
When you originally authored that report, you did not have access to the life pack material that we've used in court today, right?
Correct.
You're aware that the Attorney General's office had that information before you authored your report, right?
No.
They didn't have that information?
I don't have a recollection of that.
They didn't tell you they had that information?
I don't recall specifically from 2 years ago.
Well, that would have been pretty significant in determining your opinion in the report if you had the life pack information that gave you the EKG readings, the entire contact between Lieutenant Wilson and Manuel Ellis, right?
So it is information that I have reviewed. It has not changed the opinions that I authored in my report from February of 2022.
Well, let's talk about that because the basis of your report in February 2022 was that the existence of pulseless electrical activity, as evidenced by Lieutenant Wilson, confirmed that this was death by positional asphyxia that created hypoxia, right?
So in the report, I refer to both asystole and pulseless electrical activity as being manifestations consistent with restraint asphyxia and inconsistent with methamphetamine or primary cardiac causes of cardiac arrest.
Were you told that yesterday Lieutenant Wilson testified to this jury that in fact there wasn't pulseless electrical activity as you had believed previously?
Yes.
I'm going to object, Your Honor. That misstates the testimony.
Well, that was the testimony.
Overall,
Right, you learned that yesterday Lieutenant Wilson went through the life pack information and said that Manny Ellis had a pulse up until they started CPR, which was at, 11:41 p.m., right?
I understand that's what he testified to, yes.
And now you don't dispute that, right?
I have no basis to dispute that yet.
Well, Doctor, if Lieutenant Wilson was on scene treating Mr. Ellis and he didn't have a pulse, he would have started CPR, right?
I can't speak for Lieutenant Wilson.
Well, if he waited 4 minutes to start CPR, certainly Manny Ellis would have died because the CPR wasn't administered if there was no pulse, right?
Well, Mr. Ellis died, so
So you're suggesting that the paramedic who's treating would have sat there for 4 minutes without feeling the pulse? and not perform CPR?
No, I'm not suggesting that. And what I said was I don't have any basis to confirm or deny his opinions about the pulse.
Well, you've now seen the life pack EKG in which it indicates CPR begun at 11:41, right?
Yes,
That would be consistent with a pulse up until that point in time, correct?
correct.
And that was inconsistent with what you relied upon in your report when you originally came to this conclusion, right?
No, because there was continued pulselessness. That's why CPR was continued. And he had electrical rhythm. So the definitional criteria of pulseless electrical activity were present. And in the report, I also spoke about asystole, which was present prior to starting CPR. And asystole is a manifestation of hypoxia.
So when do we have, if that wasn't PEA up until CPR started, when did we have PEA in this case?
Shortly after CPR was started.
Which would have been after his heart stopped, right?
Correct.
So no pulseless electrical activity prior to heart stopping, if we believe what Lieutenant Wilson said yesterday.
So he had asystole, which is heart stopping, and then that evolved into pulseless electrical activity based on Lieutenant Wilson's testimony.
In your report, actually, let's skip that. Mr. Pritchard asked you a little bit about Dr. Clark's report. Dr. Clark in his report indicates that there's no anatomic cause of death. You aware of that?
Yes.
What does that mean to you?
So it means there's no pathology that explains the death, no evidence of, for example, a blocked artery or area of damage of the heart that would cause a cardiac arrest.
And that lack of anatomy is consistent with sudden death, correct?
It's consistent with many things, including restraint to hypoxia, yes.
Well, that was my question. My question was that's consistent with sudden death, right?
Well, it's consistent with certain types of sudden death. It wouldn't be consistent with sudden death due to a massive heart attack, for example, since he didn't have evidence of a massive heart attack.
That's not my question, Doctor. Someone can die of sudden death, right, without a massive heart attack, right?
Correct,
And there'd be no anatomy for a medical examiner to say that's what caused the death, right?
correct.
And one of those that's often discussed, and in fact Dr. Clark has in the past, found that excited delirium can cause sudden death where there's no anatomy, right?
You aren't going to object to counsel inserting facts that aren't in evidence or that the doctor doesn't know about.
He may know about this. I'll permit the question.
Right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Yeah.
Sure. For instance, excited delirium that you say in California, we don't, that's not a thing. But in Washington, if Dr. Clark has found that excited delirium can cause sudden death, and there's no anatomy, that'd be consistent with what Dr. Clark says, there's no anatomy to cause death in this case, right?
You'd have to ask Dr. Clark that, because I don't understand that connection.
Okay. Well, excited delirium is a constellation of, I think you said, behaviors that oftentimes is correlation with someone who suddenly dies, right?
There is that theory. I've mentioned how that theory is not accepted by any of the major medical organizations, including those that I belong to. So there are theories. That doesn't mean that I accept the theory. I mean, there are some people who still believe that the earth is flat. That doesn't mean that I accept it.
Fair enough. You admit that other doctors believe excited delirium exists, right?
Yes.
In fact, its manifestation is a strong correlation between the use of methamphetamine, right?
Yes.
And a pre-existing mental health condition, right?
Yes.
Mr. Ellis had a pre-existing mental health condition, right?
Yes.
And that the combination of those two things often creates what's called a psychosis, right?
Yes.
That causes those individuals to become agitated, right?
Yes.
To become aggressive, right?
Yes.
And to engage in conduct and then die suddenly, right?
Yes.
Consistent with what the facts are in this case, right?
Well, except for the electrical rhythms, agitated delirium, to the extent that that theory has any validity, the sudden death is due to ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia, not due to pulseless electrical activity or asystole.
So you just disagree that excited delirium can cause sudden death in the manner that's displayed in this case?
Not just disagree. I told you that I disagree with the whole concept, but I certainly disagree that to the extent that we're working with this excited delirium diagnosis or speculation, that it would explain the facts of this case.
Mr. Purtzer, had you refer to Dr. Clark's post-mortem examination report? You still have that in front of you?
I'll find it. Yes, I do.
All right, so you don't disagree that in his report, Dr. Clark says that it's unlikely that this death would have occurred due to physical restraint without contributing conditions, right?
I have your question in mind, and let me just, if you want to refer me to a page where that is stated and save some time.
So you'll see on Dr. Clark's opinions, starting in this last paragraph there, he articulates several things. Go ahead and review that if you can.
Yes, I see that statement.
Right, and so just so we're clear, Dr. Clark is a forensic pathologist, right?
Yes,
And his job is to determine the manner and cause of death, right?
yes,
You're a cardiologist, right?
yes,
And so you defer to Dr. Clark in determining the manner and cause of death.
no,
You defer to the forensic pathologist whose job is to determine manner and cause?
no, because I have knowledge as a cardiologist about the significance of cardiac rhythms, because I actually see people while they're alive. Pathologist only sees people when they're dead, when they're corpses. So a pathologist doesn't assess cardiac rhythm because he never sees cardiac rhythm. As a cardiologist, I see cardiac rhythm. I'm involved in people that have cardiac arrests, and I'm involved in the process of determining why they had the cardiac arrest, because my goal is to, if we successfully resuscitate them, to make certain that they never have another cardiac arrest. So understanding what the mechanism is part of what I do as a cardiologist. Dr. Clark doesn't do that because he doesn't see actual living patients. He sees people in the morgue, and he's looking at organ tissue. He's not looking at EKG rhythms and being able to make an analysis. So I would not defer to him insofar as my analysis is largely based on assessment of cardiac rhythms and their mechanism of death.
Well, in this case, you didn't actually examine Mr. Ellis, right?
Correct.
You never looked at his heart, right?
Correct.
You looked at some EKG readings from the life pack, right?
Yes.
Dr. Clark actually examined his body, right?
Yes.
Examined his heart.
Correct.
And he concluded that it's unlikely this death would have occurred due to physical restraint without contributing conditions, right?
That's what he concluded, yes.
The contributing conditions including the methamphetamine intoxication, right?
Yes.
The dilated heart that we discussed,
Yes.
and the physical exertion undertaken in the, I guess, interaction with law enforcement. Along with the physical restraint, I think is what he says too.
Yes.
All right. He says, furthermore, an argument could be made that the extremely high meth concentration should be considered the primary factor, right?
Yes.
Sounds like you disagree with Dr. Clark.
Well, in his supplemental report, which you're choosing not to refer to, Dr. Clark kind of walks back the assessment about methamphetamine being the primary factor because he says in his supplemental report, quote, if methamphetamine had caused this death directly, it would likely be by a cardiac dysrhythmia other than bradycardia and PEA, unquote.
Well, there's a distinction between that he's saying is the primary cause versus a contributing cause, right?
Well, the sentence that you just quoted from his autopsy report is where he says it should be considered the primary factor. So what I'm saying is in supplemental report, he clearly is walking back from methamphetamine being the primary factor.
Well, he's still saying it's a contributing factor along with the other things we've discussed.
Yes.
Okay, all right. In fact, in your report, you indicated on page 2, meth cannot be excluded as a cause of death, right?
Page 2 is a quote, is what I'm quoting from Dr. Clark. That's not my.
Well, you agree that it can be a contributing cause of death, right?
Are you talking about just generally hypothetically, or are we talking about in this case?
As it relates to, well, let's say hypothetically,
Yes.
All right. And when Ms. Eakes was asking you about what the sole cause of death was, you said it was not that, right?
Yes.
You're not saying it's not a contributing cause in this case.
Well, I've mentioned several times that methamphetamine increased his oxygen demand and made him more susceptible to the impact of decreased oxygen supply as a result of the prone restraint.
Okay. And you agreed in your report that the amount in Mr. Ellis's is known to be a fatal amount, is that right? Or within the range of a fatal amount?
I have your question in mind.
On page 3.
So page 3 is my quote from Dr. Clark's supplemental report. That's not my opinion. My opinion begins the bottom of page 3, continues through page 5, and my statement on page 5, quote, I totally reject the contention that the cause of the sudden cardiac arrest and death in this case was a methamphetamine overdose. As explained by Dr. Clark, the undeniable fact that the cardiac rhythm at the time EMS confirmed cardiac arrest was PEA is incompatible with the theory that methamphetamine was the culprit. The hypothesis that methamphetamine caused the cardiac arrest would be plausible only if the cardiac monitor that confirmed the cardiac arrest showed ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation, unquote.
Doctor, did you use that exact same language cut and paste from Humberto Martinez's report?
So I may have quoted myself. I do that all the time. Ask my kids.
Cut and paste that out of Humberto's report and put it into Mr. Ellis's report?
I don't specifically recall if it was the exact wording. I don't think I would have mentioned Dr. Clark in Mr. Martinez's case because he was not the medical examiner.
You might see that later. In your report, you also indicate that dilated cardiomyopathy is a contributing cause as well, or a contributing factor, I should say, not a cause. You agree with that, right?
Yes.
Now, if I understood your testimony this morning, it's your opinion that the sequence of events that led to the positional asphyxia was initially the restraint, is that right?
Yes.
After restraint, then there's weight put on the individual in the prone position, is that right?
Yes.
And then after in the prone position, the failure of Mr. Ellis' ability to respirate causing the hypoxia.
Yes.
Do I have the sequence correct?
Yes.
All right. Are you aware that as soon as Mr. Ellis was restrained, Matthew Ellis had no further contact with Mr. Ellis? Matthew Collins, sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question with the correct names?
Are you aware that as soon as Mr. Ellis was restrained, my client Matthew Collins had no further contact with Mr. Ellis?
I'm not specifically aware of that.
And if we follow your sequence of events that caused the death, that Matthew Collins was not in contact and did not apply weight to Mr. Ellis after restraint, he would not be responsible for the positional asphyxia injury.
So the duration of time that Mr. Collins, or Officer Collins, excuse me, was... I don't have knowledge about how long Officer Collins was on Mr. Ellis.
That's not my question.
Yeah.
My question was, you just told us the sequence that caused the death was first restraint, correct?
Yes.
After restraint, application of weight or force on the back of Mr. Ellis while in the prone position, right?
Yes.
Are you aware that my client, Matthew Collins, was not in contact, did not apply weight, or was on the back of Mr. Ellis once he was restrained?
I was not aware of that.
Are you aware that Officer Burbank was not in contact with Mr. Ellis once restrained, just like Officer Collins?
I'm not aware of that, and certainly not consistent with the testimony of Officer Rankin.
Okay. Well, do you have the statements that Officer Collins and Officer Burbank made in this case?
I don't have them with me.
Did you review Sergeant Lim's statement in this case?
I don't specifically recall.
How about Sergeant Rock?
I don't specifically recall.
You don't have any information that confirms that as soon as the hobble restraints were placed on Mr. Ellis, that both officers Collins and Burbank were relieved from their contact entirely with Mr. Ellis?
I don't have that information.
It's kind of important information, isn't it?
I'm not assigning individual responsibility or causation. That was never my role, and it's not my role today. I'm talking about the collective impact of the restraint and weight applied on Mr. Ellis's back and torso.
Judge, I think I don't have any further questions at this point. I'm going to defer to Mr. Conrad.
Okay. Mr. Conrad, cross-examination.
Good afternoon, doctor.
Good afternoon.
So I want to cover a couple of things with you before we break. So when you're taking on a case, I want to talk about the information that you review and kind of the importance of some of the information. So you'd agree with me that reviewing an individual's medical records is important prior to making an opinion in a case, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you'd agree that these medical records can help you kind of assess the overall health of an individual as well, right?
Yes.
And in this case, prior to, you got your report done and published in, date on that again?
February 13, 2022.
2022.
Yes.
That's right. And then we did a defense interview on November 14th, 2022 as well. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And prior to publishing a report or writing a report, you never had any of Mr. Ellis's medical records, right?
His prior medical records, correct.
Right. That was only provided to you after you had finished your report, and that was provided because the defense was able to obtain those records. You aware of that?
I'm not aware of who obtained the records, but I know that I was provided the records.
Okay. And that was after you'd already finalized your report.
Well, in the report, I state that I reserve the right to amend my opinions based on review of any additional materials.
Correct. But at the time that you wrote the report and provided your opinions, you never had any of Mr. Ellis's medical records.
Well, other than the medical records pertaining to the incident that caused his death on March 3rd, 2020.
Sure. But you didn't have a clinical picture of his history or background within that, right?
Correct, and having reviewed those records did not change my opinion or affect my opinion.
Okay. So you've stuck with your opinion regardless of the fact that you've now been provided some of those medical records.
Well, I wouldn't say stuck with my opinion. I reviewed the records, and I didn't see any information that changed the analysis of the cause of death regarding the incident on March 3rd, 2020.
Okay. And then at the time that you wrote your report, you never were provided any of the life pack data either, correct?
Correct.
All right. And then when we did our defense interview in November of 2022, you also had never reviewed any of the life pack data at that point either, right?
Correct.
All right. So and remind me again, you're a cardiologist for a living, right?
Yes.
And you review echocardiograms, EKGs or ECGs all the time, right?
Correct.
And the prosecution had Mr. Ellis's ECG readings and they never gave it to their expert cardiologist?
I don't know the chain of custody of the records and when and why they were provided to me. I always ask for all available records. That's my policy.
And then this email that Mr. Ossier, Jared, referenced, in which Julia Sherwin, attorney Julia Sherwin, said that your cardiologist, right, introduces you to Miss E,
Yes.
and she says that you can testify that Mr. Ellis's enlarged heart would not have killed him, right?
That's what Julia Sherwin is saying, yes.
And now you're testifying that Mr. Ellis's in large part would not have killed him, right?
Correct.
All right. And then she says, if any EKG or rhythm strips show, and if any EKG or rhythm strips show pulseless electrical activity, PEA, that he was suffering from hypoxia. The most frequent cause of PEA is hypoxia. That's what she says as well, right?
Yes.
All right. And that's what you're testifying to today as well, right?
These are opinions that I independently developed based on my review of the records.
Okay. And
For the record, this is exhibit 2740 or 44?
you know what the exhibit number is on the document?
2740.
27. And then she goes on to say that if the death were by meth intoxication, the expected rhythm would be ventricular tachycardia, right?
Yes.
And that's what you're testifying to today as well, right?
Yes, I've said ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation.
Okay, so you've added ventricular fibrillation to that, right?
Well, this is not, I did not author this statement.
Sure.
So when you're saying added to, I didn't have anything to do with this email.
Sure.
So those are Julia Sherwin's words, not my
Sherwin
words. Yeah.
Sat there and magically thought about what exactly you were going to testify to prior to ever receiving any of the medical records or reports in this case, right?
I'm gonna object.
Sustained it is.
Okay. I'll move on. Then, Ms. Sherwin, well, so let's go to your report in this case. Do you have that in front of you, doctor?
Yes, I do.
Exhibit 537.
Yes.
Okay. And you agree with me that when you're writing a report, it's important that you review all the information that we talked about, right?
Yes.
That you know, as a witness, an expert witness, that you provide a unique and independent analysis on each every case that you are providing an opinion on.
Yes.
All right. And that as an expert, you should be impartial and objective. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
All right. And that each opinion that you're providing is unique and tailored to the specific facts of each case that you're presented with, right?
Yes.
All right. And the opinions in your case, or in your report, I should say, 537, they are contained on page 3. And if you could follow along.
Yes.
And in the report, you say that and I'm looking at the bottom of page 3 under analysis and opinions. Are you following with me?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And you say that the last sentence there was the respiratory compromise and subsequent development of hypoxia and hypoxemia, is that right?
Hypoxemia.
Hypoxemia causing asystole and PEA cardiac arrest. So it's your opinion that everything that occurred to Mr. Ellis caused the development of hypoxemia, which caused asystole and PEA cardiac arrest, right?
Yes.
Okay. You don't mention anything about atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter in there, right?
Correct.
Okay. And then you go on, and if you could turn to page 5, you write, in reviewing the literature, and as confirmed by my extensive experience as a cardiologist, the only plausible and possible cause of PEA cardiac arrest in the case of Mr. Ellis was hypoxia, hypoxemia, secondary to restraint, and compressive asphyxia. Did I read that right?
Yes, you did.
No other cause of PEA is plausible or relevant in the case of Mr. Ellis.
Yes, that's what's written.
Okay. And can I hand you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit 2743.
Are you asking for my permission to hand it to me?
Well, I'm gonna hand it.
Okay, good.
So that sentence that I just read to you, that is directly copy and pasted from your previous report in the Umberto letter, is it not?
I haven't looked at this report since it was authored 5 years ago. So let me just, why don't you give me a moment to,
So I'll refer you to page 5 of the
Okay.
Umberto report. Are you with me?
yes.
Okay. Second paragraph down. Follow along with me and tell me if I'm reading this correct. In reviewing the literature and as confirmed by my extensive experience as a cardiologist, the only plausible and possible cause of PEA cardiac arrest in Mr. Martinez was hypoxia, hypoxemia, secondary to restraint / compressive asphyxia. No other cause of PEA is plausible or relevant in the case of Mr. Martinez. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Now, look back at Mr. Ellis's report. Again, here's the report that he wrote for Mr. Ellis. There is not a single word or punctuation or anything that differs other than the name that you have changed from Mr. Martinez to Mr. Ellis. Is that correct?
It's correct, but you're talking about a 5-page report. You've picked out one paragraph, and if you look at the rest of the report, there's substantial differences both in the fact pattern and in the opinions provided. So, yeah, so I acknowledge that I used the same wording in one paragraph, but if you look at the entire 5 pages, you'll see that, for example, in the Martinez report, there's no discussion of asystole.
Sure.
Where,
Let's keep
let me
going.
finish. Yeah, in this report, there is extensive discussion of asystole. So the idea that it's just a copy and paste is a misrepresentation.
Sure, but this is your opinion section, is it not?
Yes.
Okay, so let's keep going. Can you look at 537 again from the Ellis report?
Yes.
Page 5, second paragraph. I totally reject the contention. Right? Let's go to the Humberto report. Page 5. I totally reject the contention. Right? Are you following along with me?
Yes.
That the cause of sudden cardiac death, arrest, and death in this case was methamphetamine overdose.
Yes.
Okay. And if you look at Humberto's report, I totally reject the contention that the cause of sudden cardiac arrest and death in Mr. Martinez was methamphetamine. Word for word the same as well. Right?
Yeah, but I mean, you're not reading the rest of the paragraph.
Let's keep going.
No, you're not reading the rest of the paragraph that shows different wording and different conclusions.
Okay.
So, fine, yeah. I mean, like I say, I don't mind quoting myself, when, it's wording that is relevant to a case.
Sure. So the next sentence that you have, actually, you left out of Mr. Martinez's report, right? Because in Mr. Martinez's report, you write, aside from the fact that the methamphetamine blood level in Mr. Martinez was not sufficiently high to be lethal, right? That's the next start of the next sentence in Mr. Martinez's report.
Right.
Okay. You leave that out in Mr. Ellis's report, right?
So it shows that I'm not just copying and pasting, correct?
Because Mr. Ellis had lethal amounts.
I've
in
already
this case.
acknowledged that.
Okay, but you go on to say, the undeniable fact, this is Mr. Ellis's report. Right?
Yes.
Exhibit 537. The undeniable fact that the cardiac rhythm at the time of EMS confirmed cardiac arrest was PEA is incompatible with the theory that methamphetamine was the culprit, is what you write.
Yes.
Right? Let's look at the Humberto report. The undeniable fact that the cardiac rhythm at the time of cardiac arrest was PEA is incompatible with the theory that that methamphetamine was the culprit. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Back to Mr. Ellis's report again. Page 5. The next sentence. The hypothesis that methamphetamine caused the cardiac arrest would only be plausible if the cardiac monitor that confirmed this cardiac arrest showed ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. You go on to say methamphetamine, even at lethal levels of intoxication, does not, and you capitalize NOT, right, cause PEA. The only acceptable pathophysiological explanation of PEA in this case is hypoxia, hypoxemia due to asphyxia. I read that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, that's Mr. Ellis's report. Let's switch to Mr. Humberto's report. The hypothesis that methamphetamine caused the cardiac arrest would only be plausible if the AED at the time of the cardiac arrest showed ventricular fibrillation, right? So the only difference that you put in there is ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation in our case.
No.
correct?
So I use the term cardiac monitor in the Ellis report, and in the Martinez report, I use the term AED. So it's not exactly the same sentence. There are two changes, two differences, I should say, between the two reports.
Okay. You go on to state in the Martinez report, methamphetamine, even at lethal levels of intoxication, does not, again capitalized NOT, cause PEA. Your last sentence, the only acceptable pathophysiological explanation of the PEA in this case is hypoxia, hypoxemia due to asphyxia. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And those words that you wrote are the exact same words that you wrote in this case as well, right?
Yes, I mean, they're both restraint asphyxia cases. There are many similarities, and the opinions are very similar because it's the same kind of physiology.
The other thing within the Ellis report that's word for word the same as in this case, right, is on, if you look at 537, within your opinion section, is as is documented.
What page?
Four,
Okay.
Page 4. As is documented in the cardiology literature, PEA may be caused by many conditions, but is most frequently caused by hypovolemia or hypoxemia. Hypoxia secondary to respiratory failure is probably the most common cause of PEA, with respiratory insufficiency accompanying 40 to 50% of PEA cases. And then you cite the e-medicine article, right?
Yes.
And if you look back at the Humberto report, page 5, you state the exact same thing. As is documented in the cardiology literature, PEA may be caused by many conditions. It is most frequently caused by hypovolemia, hypoxemia, hypoxia secondary to respiratory failure is probably the most common cause of PEA, with respiratory insufficiency accompanying 40 to 50% of PEA cases, and you cite the same thing, right?
Yeah, it was true then. It's true now. I mean, if some facts are, if I say the sun rises in the east, I'll put that in every report because the sun always rises in the east. So, yeah.
Okay. And you've actually testified, you said about in 10 cases, is that right? 10 restraint-related cases?
I haven't testified in 10. I
Sorry,
think I've
you've
offered,
been
involved in, yes.
Okay. And by my count, you were involved in I guess, 4 other cases that also involved Mr. Freeman that were restraint-related, correct?
Yes.
Both for the plaintiff, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then, by my count, there are 6 cases. The Stickney case versus City of Phoenix, remember that?
Yes.
And in there you said it's PEA and that's inconsistent with, that's consistent with restraint-related death, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then in the Alves versus Riverside County case, you said the same thing. PEA consistent with restraint-related death, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then in the Suarez versus City of Hollywood case, you said the same thing. PEA consistent with restraint-related death, correct?
I don't recall the specifics of that case and what I specifically said.
Humberto case we've already covered. You said PEA consistent with restraint-related death, correct?
Yes.
Bauer versus City of Pleasanton, you said PEA consistent with restraint-related death.
I don't specifically recall, but I'm not contesting that.
Okay. Looney versus Vernon, I believe. Again, PEA consistent with restraint-related death.
I don't recall that case, yeah, but again, I'm not, I assume you're reading from a reliable source.
Doctor, that's a lot of PEA in a lot of cases that you're finding that based on EKGs or based on what you're seeing, you're saying the same thing every single time.
Well, when there's a certain fact pattern, you have to analyze it in a consistent way, and PEA is a manifestation of hypoxia, and in a situation of restraint, it is consistent with that restraint asphyxia causing hypoxia and cardiac arrest.
Do you remember during our defense interview, I specifically asked you, where within this event did you see PEA? You remember me asking you that?
Not specifically.
Okay. Do you have your interview up there?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Can you flip to page 50, please? And look at lines 3 through 15.
This is page 50 of what?
This is exhibit 538. Sorry, Judge. Are you there?
Yes.
And at this point, obviously you're trying to give truthful answers during your defense interview, right?
Yes.
And based on the information that had been provided to you by the Attorney General's office as well as the defense.
Yes.
Okay. And I asked you at what point did Mr. Ellis have PEA, right?
Yes.
And you said that the PEA occurred at 23:37, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that was based off of the EKG strip that you had seen, 23:37. Is that right?
Yes.
And can we bring up, please publish 2739, please? And can we go to that?
Has this been admitted?
It has been. It has been. Can we scroll to 2337?
You're talking about the time now.
Correct.
So
So it'll be 11:37.
I think we're there.
I don't think we're there. Well, actually, sorry, you said 11:37:32, right?
2337 is what I see in the interview transcript.
Okay. And that was based off of the pre-hospital care report that you were looking at, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you were referencing the first EKG rhythm strip that you were seeing there in the pre-hospital care report.
Yes.
Okay. And if you could refer to Exhibit 24, I believe should be in front of you.
Exhibit 24 is on the screen or on?
Sorry. Well, let me say this to you. So the first EKG rhythm strip that we see, right, on the pre-hospital care report appears at 23:37:32, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that's where you noted with your defense interview, that's where you said that's PEA, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we're at 23:37:32. Do you see that on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. And you're now aware, right, that Lieutenant Wilson testified that Mr. Ellis had a pulse at this time, right?
Yes, I obviously was not aware of Officer or Lieutenant Wilson's comments at the time of my interview back in November of 2022.
Okay. Well, you had his interview, right? You had his previous interview.
Yeah, but I don't believe that his interview, he stated that Mr. Ellis still had a pulse at this time.
Okay. And so, well, the pre-hospital care report indicates that CPR didn't take place until 11:41, right?
Yes.
So when you were initially looking at this based on the information that was provided to you, you were saying that he didn't have a pulse at this point, and that's why you were determining that this was pulseless electrical activity, right?
Yes, based on this EKG where you see it says SpO2 searching for pulse.
Yeah.
And there was no indicator that there was a pulse detected. And the EKG rhythm showed a intact rhythm, so that would meet the criteria for pulseless electrical activity. An intact rhythm that would be able to sustain circulation and absence of pulse.
Well, PEA requires a organized electrical activity, right?
Yes, and when you have a ventricular rhythm at a rate that is consistent with normal circulation, that's sufficient to be called organized electrical activity.
Let me interrupt for a second. How much longer have you got, Mr. Conn? I'm not trying to rush you, just want to know, because we're at 4:15 already.
I probably have another 20 minutes or so.
Okay. So we're going to break for the day.
Okay.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, please do not discuss a case among yourselves with anyone else. Do not permit anyone to discuss a case with you or in your presence. And of course, avoid any reports on the subject of this trial from any other source.